Hello everyone. Today in this demo I am doing the chalkboard version of Pissarro shapes. So what we do is we go through it once in the chalkboard format, then we'll go through it again in a format where we're working with paint and we're like I'm showing you how to go through exactly the same steps that I'm about to demonstrate on the chalkboard, but I'll be demonstrating those steps again to you in paint, and then you workshop through the forms in class using the same colors that you see in the demo, with me working alongside of you. And this is to just help all that information sink in, because it's sort of a lot of information. But the reason that I punch this information a lot, working on these geometric shapes, and literally what I like to do is call it sculpting, because I want you to feel like you're actually sculpting these shapes, but in value and later in value and color, is these geometric shapes are the building blocks of all the forms that you're going to be painting and doing value studies of, working up in chiaroscuro, the Italian word for light and dark, working through trompe-l'oeil paint technique. Trompe-l'oeil means to trick or to fool the eye. You're going to be doing these steps over and over again on various different forms in class. And once the whole system sort of syncs up for you, then all of a sudden you find that you can sculpt any form that you're presented with. You can figure out how to sculpt that form and make a very credible representation of that form using these building blocks. Now, Pissarro refers to the artist Camille Pissarro. You have some pictures of his work in your research. Does he really deserve credit for this? I don't know. I'll be honest. I was taught back in middle school that these were called Pissarro shapes. And that art teacher taught us how to draw these basic shapes. And I was obsessed. I kept drawing these shapes over and over again in the margins of my notebook. And I was just so amazed. It was like, oh, finally, it was like somebody just gave me the key. Now I can make this thing look real. And I was so excited. And I'm hoping and actually expecting you to do the same. So I want you to start just working on these shapes. I want you to find yourselves doing them in the corner of your notebook. I certainly, as you watch this demo, this chalkboard demonstration, I want you to be doing it along with me. So I want you to pull out a piece of paper and a pencil, and I want you to be going through these steps with me, because it's going to stick better if you do that. In addition to this, I'll also be demonstrating a form called a torus. Okay? The torus is basically the donut, the big donut of life, the bagel of life, as referred to by the students of a scenic art teacher named Lester Polikoff. Now, Lester Polikoff's maintained, and he taught this technique to his students, that if they could learn how to, once again, sculpt this shape two-dimensionally, then they could attack any problem. And he's right. I like to teach the step of the Pissarro shapes in addition to teaching the torus. More is just more. I have found portfolio work, and that's in the reference that I gave you as well, that predates Camille Pissarro. And, I'm kind of stuck with it now because I refer to these as Pissarro shapes in the book that Peter Budare and I co-authored, so I'm sort of stuck with it, whether the research and the information was faulty or not. Should have cross-checked that. It's a little late now. But it's clear in Pissarro's work. It's clear in the work of so many different artists how fundamental being able to sculpt these basic geometrical forms is. So we're going to go with it. It's easier to say Pissarro shapes than it is to say, well, the cube and the sphere and like you can do a cone or a pyramid. I don't know. And don't forget the cylinder, right? It's just easier to go Pissarro shapes, and we all know what we're talking about. So let's just be stuck with it. It's a lexicon that conveys information very quickly. So please go get your piece of paper and your pencil, and we're going to start with the cube. All right, we're going to start with the cube. The first thing I'm going to do is just draw the contour of a three-dimensional cube. So we want to draw the bottom and the top lines parallel to one another. You can use a straight edge to do this if you want. And then find that point where it looks like it's a good square shape, right? The face of our cube. Actually, I'm going to start with this line right here off this corner. And I'm just drawing a long line to begin with so that I can see the relationship of these lines on the edges that are perpendicular to the picture plate. So then when I draw this line and I draw this line, the concept is that I'm cheating a little bit, doing something that's called sight perspective to some extent, so that it feels as if there's a point in the distance where those lines are actually going to converge and meet on a point on a horizon line. In other words, so it feels natural. Now, sometimes when you look at people describing how to draw a cube, they'll say, make these lines that are receding into the distance, they'll say that you should make those lines be parallel to one another, right? If you do that, it actually looks like the back of the cube is larger than the front of the cube. So, as long as I'm freehanding it, I just cheat it a little bit so that it feels more natural in terms of depth. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put these sticks up here and go, okay, does it feel like they would connect in the distance? Yeah, it definitely does. It's a long ways away, so I'm just going to cheat this one up just a little bit. Right, and pull it up that much farther. All right, and then I'm going to check these lines out real quick. And, you don't have to struggle, I guess is a good word. You don't have to struggle this much with drawing your cube. You're just trying to figure out how to make it look good in chiaroscuro. Just kind of do it for the sake of doing it, because otherwise it just bugs me. Okay, now the next thing is how deep should this be? We know that if it's actually a completely square, meaning that every single plane on every side of the cube, every single edge is exactly the same length. If it's actually a square cube, right? Which is, I get it, yeah, that's redundant. Then this line here should be as long as this line here, except this line is going back into depth, into the distance. This is supposedly perpendicular-ish to your picture plane. So, you know, you don't want to make this line be the same distance as that line, because then that cube is actually not going to look like a cube anymore. It's definitely going to look like it's based on a rectangle, a cubed rectangle. So what we're going to do is we know how long that line is in reality, but we're just going to drop back from that by a factor of about 25% to make it look like it lives in depth. This line, this edge, has to be parallel to this edge, which means that from this corner back here, this edge, this line has to be parallel. This edge here has to be parallel to this edge, all right? So then we have the shape of our cube. All right. Now we've drawn our cube. I want to also have you, just very, very lightly, as you draw this cube, I want you to make sure that you're aware of where the lines are going to be on the back of this cube, okay? As if the cube is made of glass, because there'll come a point in this exercise where we're going to need to be able to visualize where that corner is when we're figuring out our cast shadow. So now I want to go through some terms with you, because I'll be referring to things by names, even as we're sculpting this out in, chiaroscuro, or sort of, chalkboard version of it. All right. The first thing I'm going to talk about is shade. So the shade is the first step that we usually do, or the way I teach it, the way that the object is initially sculpted. The cool thing is, once trompe-l'oeil starts to click for you, I'll say this to you probably too many times. Once you know where all the shades go, you know where everything goes after that. And you'll be like, whatever, Susan. And then, like, one day it'll click and you'll be like, yeah, actually, I do know where everything else goes now that I've done the shade. I get it. So hopefully you'll, have that sensation, that click. After that, I'm going to be talking about low light. After that, I'll be talking about primary highlight. And then secondary highlight. When we get into actually doing trompe-l'oeil in paint, I'll also be talking about a cut line. I'll be talking about cast shadows. And I'll be talking about bounce lights. Okay? So, just this is the beginning of a nomenclature. Now, are these the words that everybody else in the whole world uses when they discuss trompe-l'oeil? No. A lot of people use these words, but not everybody does. Lexicon it's just a tool for us to be able to communicate with each other. So and it's also a tool for me to identify a certain part of the process so that I can communicate it to you. So I will be using these terms throughout, and by using these terms, and helping you like start to focus in on what those terms mean and what the function of those terms are is part of how you're going to learn trompe-l'oeil. Then you may end up going to another shop or working with another artist, and they'll say something and you'll be like, what does that mean? And you'll ask them and they'll say, oh, well, when I say tone it, and you'll be thinking, oh, okay, that's what I refer to as the shade step. Ta-da! Just as long as you can communicate. All right, so I'm just going to talk about, in the chalkboard demonstration, mostly the concept of chiaroscuro. We're going to go into projecting cast shadows a little bit, but beyond that, I not going to say, oh, the cut line goes here. We're going to save that for when I actually do the demonstration of trompe-l'oeil with paint. All right. So, erasing these. Everybody wrote them down? You ready? Okay. Like you're actually talking back to me. All right. So I want you to think. In fact, I don't even want you to think right now. I want you to look. Hopefully you're watching this in, a room somewhere. If you're sitting in the dark, watching this, you might want to turn a light on. If you look at the planes of a room, usually when I teach this, at this point, I say, everybody turn around, okay? In fact, let's do that. Let's turn around. Look at the walls of the shop. By the way, that's Cass O'Neill back there. So look at the walls of the shop. Look at how the value changes across the walls of the shop. A plane does not end up taking light absolutely equally across the whole breadth of it. The light and the quality of light changes, especially on larger planes. We use this to our advantage as scenic artists. Remember, we're sculpting, but we're also artists, so we're pushing it a little bit. We don't have, we're compensating for the fact that we're actually working on a two-dimensional surface. So people who are looking at this aren't like it's all one depth. Depth perception isn't telling them anything. So we're pushing the issue just a little bit. So when we approach an object that is just planes, right, like this cube, we want to play with that a little bit so that we, in a sense, sort of over-describe the object just a little bit. Still feels natural, but we're artists. We're amplifying, and we're also painting it in such a way, because we're scenic artists, so that it reads from a distance. So, shade, I'm going to be using this light blue chalk for shade, okay? What I'm going to do is, first of all, deciding where my light source is. Light source coming down from there, okay? And I actually have a cube right here, okay? So as we look at this cube, okay, first of all, there's something that I want you to notice. Remember, I said we're going to draw a box here, and we drew, a square, as close to a perfect square as we could. What happens when you see a perfect square on a cube? That's all you see. You don't see anything else. You just see a square, right? So even the way we drew this cube is a little bit of a contrivance, all right? We know that. We're going to go ahead and describe it anyway. So what we're actually trying to do is we're actually trying to draw a cube that is kind of like that. But you can see, even as I do that, that actually changes this line and this line. they're not parallel anymore because they're receding out into depth as well. Aha, right? All right, moving on. So here's my cube. Now, if I hold it, now I know it's just made out of pieces of crescent board that are painted gray. But if I hold it, you can see that the light isn't hitting this face. Granted, the face is probably absolutely not a completely flat plane, but there's light that's coming, that's bouncing up like a little bit, and that's probably because it's curving and catching the light. But on a regular, like an actual cube, what I want you to think about is the fact that if I sit it on a table, oh, I did it with the computer. Of course, the computer doesn't work because I have an HD camera, right? So if I sit it on a surface, the light might actually bounce up. This is not cooperating at all, but the light might actually bounce up, say from a surface, and catch a little bit of reflective light towards the bottom and have it be a little bit darker towards the top, right? So we're going to go with that. We're going to go with that contrivance. We're going to do one more contrivance as well. Don't you love the production values of these things, you guys? Okay, there we go. All right, yeah. We're going to go with one more contrivance too. We're actually going to think ahead. And we're going to think ahead to where the light is hitting this object the most forcefully, right? Where it's the brightest. And we're actually going to emphasize. We're going to do a contrivance that will help emphasize the plane that's catching the most light. So we know that this plane up here, light's coming down like that. This plane up here is catching the most light, right? The plane on the top of the cube. This plane that we can't see on the back side of the cube here, all right, it's catching light, and this plane is catching light. Here's the cool thing about a cube. How many facets of a cube can actually physically catch light at one time from a single light source? The answer is never more than 3. It can only be 3 at a time, okay? It can actually be, for the most part, depending on the position of the light source and the plane, as small as 1. But only 3 planes at the most can ever catch light, nor can you ever see more than 3 planes of a cube at any one time. And understanding geometry in just really basic geometry actually helps make you a better scenic artist. You know, you have this sort of innate knowledge of how physical objects work in the world. And that's part of what is good about Pissarro shapes as well. So we're going to decide where the shade is going to go. Now we know this bad boy over here on the opposite side of our light source, dude, he is totally in the shade. This one though, he's catching light. But what we're going to do is we're going to use our shade, and we're just going to, actually we're going to try and find a piece of chalk that's working with me a little bit better, okay? And we're going to lay a shade on this side of the cube, all right? But what we're going to do is contrivance. So you're going to hear me say theatrical cheat and contrivance a lot in this. So contrivance. I'm going to start my shade right out along this edge, okay? And I'm going to have it be kind of darkest on this edge because I know that this is my lightest plane. So by having it be a darker just below that, it's going to emphasize the fact that this is a brighter plane. And what I'm actually going to do, and this is totally a contrivance as well, is I'm actually going to structure my shade on this so that I'm going through the side of this plane on an angle, right? So that it's fading out as it comes down to this corner. So by the time I get back down to this corner, I'm just leaving that the base coat again, the regular color that I've painted this cube in, okay? But this, I'm like laying a little bit of shade here on this side of this cube. Now, this side, and that will emphasize the brightness that the top of that cube is going to be. Now, this side of the cube, right? This side of the cube is totally not getting light. So we know that this bad boy is in the shade. Now, we're going to work with sort of the concept of two darker values than our base coat here as I explain these Pissarro shapes to you. So you could say, well, why do I even bother with the shade? Why don't I go directly to the darkest value, which you can do. You can totally do. The fact of the matter is, though, that when we're painting, frequently our colors are like either like they're purposefully transparent or a little bit transparent. And so if you're like expecting that one color actually enhances the value of another color, then you simply have to get that other color, i.e. the shade, on there, all right? So we are totally going to put the whole side, unapologetically put the whole side of this off-lit side of the cube in shade, okay? So, bye-bye. All right? By doing this, remember I said the shade is part of the, like once you put the shade on, you know where everything goes. The other thing about the shade is once you've put the shade on, you already are able to see structure. You're already clearly, you should already be able to clearly see your structure, and that's important. If you're not seeing your structure yet, let me think, you know, what else does it need? All right, so now we're going to go to essentially what we call sort of the low light. So, any low light on the top? Of course not, right? It's receiving direct light. Any low light on this? Well, technically this is in the shade. The low light's only going to go in places where light can't reach on this form, right? And don't get low light confused with cast shadow. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come along and I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I just did, exactly sort of the same contrivance where I did my shade sort of at an angle here, right? I'm going to do my low light on this side at an angle. And I'm just going to blend it out from this corner here to that corner there. Still a plane. You don't want to see any creases or edges. All right? You just want, I don't know why I was trying to blend it. It's chalk. Okay. You just want it to drop back, right? And this corner will be just a little bit lighter than this front corner. Once again, this is emphasizing. Now by doing this, see shade, low light, with this this is just base coat. And it's already has depth because it is like just the base coat color, right? So now I can come along on this bad boy and I can lay a little bit of a highlight, working with my primary highlight here. I can lay my primary highlight here. And I'm going to let it fade out to the base coat color back a ways, right? I can just lay my highlight color in there and totally, like, you know, get a really, really strong structure into that. And then when you're doing highlights, you need to think about highlighting form or shape. And then you also need to think about highlighting edges, all right? With shade and low light For the most part, sometimes a low light or a shade is just a line, but that's because the form is very, very tight. With the dark edges, we're going to, as you'll see in the next set of videos I do on painting trompe-l'oeil, the edges, the dark edges, are going to be emphasized with a step called the cut line. So generally, you don't do any edge work with your shade and low light. You're just going to paint to the edge, okay? Now, thinking about this light source here, right? What edges is it catching? Like if it's hitting, coming in at an angle, down mostly from the top, right? Like, you know, at a 60-degree angle there. If it's this corner is going to be the hottest, right here, right? This little corner is going to be the hottest. So, in a sense, all of my edge work for my highlight is going to radiate out from that corner. So we know that this edge is going to catch a nice highlight. We know this edge is going to catch a highlight, but I'm just going to let it like fade out as it goes towards the back, away from me in depth. I'm going to let that highlight fade out. And then we know that this edge is going to catch a highlight. Once again, I'm letting it fade out a little bit before it gets to the bottom. Right? In terms of these things where you're like letting a line fade out, initially just concentrate on where the lines go, and then you'll as I critique you and as we talk about it, I'll be like, you could have let that line fade out a little bit. And you'll be like, oh, maybe now I'm starting to see what she means. Okay. Some of you will be more instinctual. Some of you, you know, you'll be like, all right, but you'll all get there. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about projecting a cast shadow, okay? So light's coming in from this direction, okay? We know that this plane back here in the back is catching light. We know that this plane in the front is catching light. We know this plane absolutely is catching light. So what planes are casting shadows? So it's going to be this plane here and this plane back here. Those are the two planes. These are the two edges that are casting shadow. So if my light source is coming in from this direction, I'm going to go off of this corner and this corner. I'm just going to lightly draft out my cast shadow going into a distance from those two corners, the two front corners of the two planes that are in the shade, okay? Then we know that this cast shadow, like, it gets defined by this edge here. So I'm going to draw that edge, and this cast shadow here gets defined by this edge. So I'm going to draw that edge, and then we've drafted out our cast shadow. Sorry, I always feel so bad when I have my back to the camera. It's kind of, I thought about putting the camera at an angle, and I was like, that's not going to work. It'll make things more confusing. All right, so the cube, that's our first one. Remember what I said. I want you to start drawing as you learn these forms. I want you to start drawing them in the corners of your notebooks and stuff like that. You know, just start getting these simple shapes in your head and start looking for these shapes in the world. Start looking for how different objects that you see in the world are literally composed of, like, you know, the cubes. Oh, that's a cylinder. Oh, that's sort of spherical, right? Look for this, and then you'll start to understand how these shapes are like our building blocks in terms of how we sculpt the world. So I'm going to stop now, clean up, and we're going to go on to the sphere next. Okay, we're going to start working on the sphere now. So there's this story that the Pope, I can't remember which one, asked Giotto, the artist, if he was qualified to work on a fresco at the Vatican. Giotto, replied by just freehanding a perfect circle. I don't know if the story is real, but I think of it every time I try to draw a circle. All right. And yes, I could have used a compass, but I was feeling frisky. Okay, so the sphere, and it just so happens, I have one right here. I have a sphere. Okay, so here we have our sphere, and I still have our light source right here that I've turned on, right? So you can see the values on this sphere, right? With light source coming from there, hitting the sphere here. There's also other light sources in this room. Actually, if I turn them off, for a minute, we would have hopefully a little bit more drama, right? Okay. Now, as you look at this sphere against this light source, I hope that one of the things that's coming to your mind right away, and it should, is the moon, because I'm going to be referring to the moon frequently as I go through this explanation of how to draw a sphere and how to sculpt a sphere. How to draw a sphere is pretty easy. It's a circle. One of the first things I want you to do, remember with the box, this cube, we gave ourselves like structure lines. It's like, how do you structure a sphere? It's actually pretty straightforward. What you want to do with the sphere is, once again, it's like, here's our light source, right? What you want to do with the sphere is you're going to want to track the axes, okay? So you're going to have a vertical axis, which is going to line right up with your light source. And then perpendicular to that, you're going to have another axis, right? These are very, very important, because when I held up this, one of the things that I'm sure that you noticed, I'm hoping, is that it looks like, there's actually a pretty, discrete line where the light source changes. And remember I asked you how many sides of a cube could possibly be receiving light at one time? Well, how much of a sphere can possibly be receiving light at one time? And the answer is always just a little bit less than half of it. All right, even if the sun is the light source, it's going to be damn close to exactly half that sphere, i.e. the moon, that is catching light. But it's going to be because of the geometric shape of the form. It's always going to be just a tiny bit less than half. Now, if you have a sphere that's really, really close to the light source, right, it might be a good deal less than half the object, right? Because if you think about it, you've got your sphere, right? You've got, if your light source is right here, you're like, oh, that's about as much of that sphere that can actually be catching the light at that point. Once the light gets farther away, that can become a larger part because the angle will the angle will start to, basically the angle's getting tighter, but farther away. Okay, so geometrically, that's just how it works. So when we think of the sphere, go ahead and just think of half the sphere in the light at a time, okay? This is really important because as you're looking at the sphere in relationship to your light source, I don't want you to lose track of these points here on the side of the horizontal or perpendicular axis to your light source, all right? These are very important. Here's one of the things that makes me a little bit nuts when I see spheres like sculpted, and what people will do, you've got a sphere here, okay? And what they'll do is they'll decide, right, to put like this overextended crescent, okay? You see the moon stylized like that sometimes with this like overextended crescent, okay? Like technically, yes, if the light source is close, it actually could look like that. But it's usually happening because people are just not aware of like the geometric structure of the form that they're drawing. We're going to go ahead and shade this and sculpt this and do the chiaroscuro as if the light source is basically the sun. Okay, so it's pretty far away. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just lay my shade in. Now, when I lay that shade in, I want you to think about something. I want you to think, oh, like what shape is that curve? The thing that I want you to do throughout the entire exercise of sculpting the sphere is I want you to keep visualizing as if this is actually a form that you could cut into. I want you to keep visualizing that ellipse, right, that defines that rim where the back half of the sphere drops into shade. Because remember, this is our light source, but our light source is actually coming at our sphere at an angle like this, right? So that means that our light source is actually hitting our sphere probably right around that point there, okay? This is probably the point closest to our light source, right about there. So there's going to be this half of the sphere that's in the light and this under half, the underside that's in the shade, okay? Now I'm going to get into one of the contrivances that I've told you all about. And you're going to hear me say this a lot whenever we're dealing with a form that's curved in some fashion, especially if it is a compass curve, i.e. based on like a complete curve, like a cylinder, a sphere. I'm going to talk about the rule of threes. The rule of threes is a contrivance, but it's a contrivance that works. So we keep going back to it. And if you initially know the rule of threes, you can kind of mess around with it depending on where the light source is in your composition. But initially, if you're like, I just know dead to rights how to paint that thing and make it look absolutely circular or absolutely cylindrical, then, right, once you've got that like in your tool belt, then you can like start fussing with it and start messing around with it a little bit. So in using the rule of threes on the sphere, what I'm going to do is I am going to make sure, starting at these axes right here, right, at these points at the end of this axis, I am going to describe this sphere and what we can see of this sphere by putting approximately 1/3 of the surface that I can see in shade, okay? So about 1/3 of this. And this is, there we go. About 1/3 of this is going to go into shade. And by doing that, I know it's formulaic, but I know I have a recipe for success, right? It's like I can mess around with the Tall House cookie recipe, use macadamia nuts instead of walnuts, or use mint chocolate chips, or add some matcha powder to it, and like call it matcha Tall House cookie, green tea Tall House cookies, whatever. But the thing is, like, initially when I'm baking my Tall House cookies for the first time, I'm gonna follow the recipe on the back of that damn, bag, because I know that's gonna work. All right, so that's where I want you to start. I want you to start by following the recipe. So what we're gonna do is we can definitely blend this line, right? But we're definitely going to have this shade describe about 1/3 of the surface area. Now I'm going to get into another concept. So two coming at you at once here. The other concept is called creeping shade and creeping light, okay? So here I've got the rest of the surface of my sphere. That surface of that sphere it's moving away from me in depth, right? Got like my shade, where my shade is supposed to be, but as like this sphere like moves through the picture plane, so to speak, it's moving away from me. So I want to also use a contrivance to help describe how it's moving away from me. Remember how we messed around with the planes of the cube and let the back end of the highlight top of the cube kind of drop back into the base color, so it dropped back in value a little bit as it dropped back in the picture plane. So what we're going to do here is on the edge, very, very subtly, of this sphere, we're just going to put in kind of a creeping shade, okay? It should be subtle, right? But it's going to help, like, tell the viewer that the back, this sphere is moving back. It's structural. It's three-dimensional. It's moving back in the picture plane. All right? So there we go. Now, once again, it's like, yes, I know what shape that is, right? Just like the cube. Yes, I know what shape that is. Except this isn't, like, sort of really satisfying. Like, yeah, we do know what shape it is, but boy, some more description would be really, really helpful. So we're going to move on to the low light step. And in the low light step, I've got my shade area here, which is about 1/3 the surface of my sphere. So I'm going to go for 1/3 again of that area. And I'm going to put 1/3 of my shade area into low light. And remember I said creepy light just a few short minutes ago? So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to leave on the bottom edge of this sphere, I'm going to leave a little bit of my shade showing underneath this low light, so that there's kind of this sense of a creeping light, okay? Once again, I can blend it along this edge because this is a curved surface, so we want it to be blended. We want it to be a fairly smooth transition, all right? But try to make sure, like, pay attention to those thirds because they're really, really helpful. Okay, and then this, like, yeah, all of a sudden it's like, yeah, that's starting to feel, more natural, seeing like a change in value there. Now we're going to add in the highlight. Once again, the rule of thirds. So I am going to put my highlight in at right about 2/3, 1/3, 1/3, 2/3, right? That's where I'm going to put my highlight in. This is the primary highlight, remember. Now you'll notice that I'm not putting in a perfect circle, right? I'm creating an oval out of my highlight. I'm making sure that it's centered on my axis there, okay? And this is 1/3 of the area that's left. So it's like 1/3, 2/3, okay? Why is it an oval? It feels right, but you're like, I don't know. Okay? So if you're looking, yes, I know what this looks like, so whatever. If you're looking directly, if you are the sun, right, and you're looking directly at your sphere and creating a highlight, that highlight is going to be a perfect circle, okay? But if that highlight is actually moving away from you, right? See, it starts to become an oval because that's what happens. It's just, whenever you think about a sphere, I want you to think about that circle that you're dealing with right there and where that circle is placed on your form relative to what you're painting. So that's why this highlight becomes an oval. Okay? So once again, because this is a curved surface, we definitely want to do some blending, right? Do a little bit of blending, make it soft. Then we can come back with our secondary highlight and we can make it a little bit more intense if we want to make it look nice and shiny. Okay? All right, so that's our sphere, and it's really pretty straightforward. You're going to remember the rule of threes. You're going to remember creeping light. Now, here's one more thing that we're going to throw in right now, and that's the concept of bounce light. So suppose this is sitting on a surface, right, that just happens to have, in this case, pink cloth on it, right? And we want to, like, even enhance the roundness of this object a little bit more. What we're going to do is we're just going to throw in a little bit of pink bounce light down there, okay? It's catching the bounce of the local color of the object that it's sitting on, of the object that's adjacent to it. That's just like our toe in the water into bounce light there, okay? And because that's not very seeable, I'm going to go to more intense color chalk there, so maybe you can see it a little bit better. All right. So that's the concept of drawing, sculpting a sphere. Now the last thing is the cast shadow. And I don't know if you remember in your basic geometry how, what is the connection between a sphere and a plane? It can only be one point. Geometrically, a sphere can only meet a plane at one point, okay? So where is that point? That's the first thing we want to find out, is where is that point? Well, because we're looking at this, we might be looking down at it. The actual point of connection is going to be under a little bit, okay? Because we're looking down at it a little bit. So part of the mass of the sphere is in the way of our actually being able to see it. Our light source is coming at it like this. So we're going to project our cast shadow off at an angle, okay, away from that point where the sphere is resting on the surface. Now, what part of the sphere is in cast shadow? Well, the part of the sphere where the light doesn't reach. Here's the fun part about the geometry of a sphere. So we can go back to this line, our initial ellipse. We could carve a disc along this circumference right here, this ellipse. We could carve a disc out and leave it in place. We could take all the top part of the sphere away, all the bottom part of the sphere away, and it would be casting exactly the same shadow as if the rest of the sphere was there, because that's the only part that counts, is where there's a transition from light to dark. So this, going along the angle of our light source, is where that shadow is going to land. All right, so we've projected off from this point in a direction that's receding at an angle from the light source. And then we know that our shadow is going to be this long. It's going to be elliptical in shape. And if you want to see why it's elliptical in shape, just turn off all the lights and grab yourself the lid to any container and just hold it up against the wall, and you'll be like, oh yeah, like that's the shape the shadow makes. Here, I think we can do that right now. See if this works. Right? Need to do it from this side. Right? That's the shape the shadow makes. Okay? So it's hard to do this. This is the shadow of my arm right there. That's the shape, there we go, of the lid. Okay? So hence there is our cast shadow of our sphere. Yay! And that's the sphere, okay? Move on now to the cylinder. All right, cylinders. I happen to have a cylinder right here. Oh, that's amazing. Okay, this one I forgot to dust the top off of. But turning the lights out again. Okay. Get it the right. Yeah, it's pretty much half and half here. Let's see if I can get it like, there we go. So we're going to go for the same concept that we did with the sphere. We're going to go for the 1/3 to 2/3 ratio. It's just a good ratio, guys. It makes things look round. It's a good pat contrivance. And initially, that's where I want you to start, is with that contrivance, and try to get it smooth. Try to go, oh yeah, like I know, like the highlights in exactly the right place. And then after you've got a handle on that, if you're, say, painting a loggia and the light source in relationship to the columns in the loggia are changing, then you can make those adjustments much more easily and masterfully if you've gotten this, rule of 3 ratio down first. So initially, first of all, I'm just going to draw my cylinder. When you're drawing a cylinder, I want you to think a little bit of initially drawing a cube. So I've got to put my back to you. Got to hard to draw parallel lines off at an angle. Okay, so This line and this line represent the axes of the top and bottom of our cylinder, okay? So what we're going to do is, I want you to think about having a cylindrical object, and you have that picture in the reference that I supplied with this lecture to look at of the studio examples, the top hat and the goblet from the student portfolio of Thomas Walford Grieve. That's in a collection in Bristol. And if you're drawing a cylindrical object, the thing that you've got to remember is, as you draw the axes through that cylindrical object, and as you draw that cylindrical object, so I'm going to hold this trash can up right now so that the top of the trash can is right essentially lined up. We know it's lined up on this horizon line. How do we know that? Because it's straight. It's absolutely straight, okay? So that's what an ellipse looks when it's lined up directly at the height of the horizon line. It's just going to be a straight line. But you can see the bottom of this trash can, right? It is dropping down. And if it was made of glass, we could see the elliptical shape of the bottom of the trash can, which is a circle, right? That is being foreshortened into an elliptical shape. Same thing happens if we hold the trash can up now so that the bottom is directly in line with the horizon line. But now you can see how the top is curving up and around, okay? So that's what you're thinking of when you're drawing the cylinder. We're going to draw this cylinder as if we're looking down on it. And the reason we want to do that is because we're going to make basically a trash can out of the cylinder. We're going to have it be a hollow cylinder that we can see down inside so that we can talk about how the shades and highlights work on the inside or the back side of the cylinder as light hits that, all right? So we have these axes. So if we're looking down at this, we know that this ellipse is more tightly configured or foreshortened than this ellipse, right? Because that ellipse is farther down. So we're going to see a deeper curve in that bottom of the bottom of that ellipse, all right? So I'm going to start, and if you need to, give yourself like a little bit of a center line so you keep yourself honest about where the deepest or the widest part of your ellipse is. And also that like kind of gives you, because you want it, your ellipse has got to be equidistant in terms of the height of that ellipse on that horizontal axis. So I'm going to start with this ellipse. And here's the thing about ellipses, right? One of my pet peeves about ellipses, whenever you're drawing an ellipse that represents a foreshortened circle, do not draw the Eye of Horus, okay? Don't do it. These are not points. These are always, the ellipse always curves, all right? So always structure your ellipse because it's a circle that you're drawing, all right? It's not the Eye of Horus. So get yourself out of the habit of doing the Eye of Horus now, if you would. All right, so this is the depth of the ellipse at the top of our cylinder, all right? So we know that the depth of this ellipse at the bottom of the cylinder is going to be deeper, okay? So we're going to draw that deeper. And a lot of times when I do draw things like this, like I'm drawing a cylinder, I try not to draw, you know? I don't rely on drawing just half of the ellipse. It always looks cleaner, looks like a better drafting if I like even lightly at least draw the back side as if I'm drawing the object as if it was made of glass. Okay, so keeps me honest. Make sure that my form is well drafted. Okay, so now we have our cylinder shape. This part is so straightforward because we're going back right again to the rule of threes. Light source. Light source is coming in at an angle, all right? So my shade, so much easier than the sphere. Basically, it's just a vertical shape, and I just need to put 1/3 of the front surface area that I see in this cylinder in shade. Now, because this is a round surface, I can blend that line a little bit, right? And there's my shade. Now, same as the sphere on this side, because this cylinder is curving away from us, curving off into the picture plane. I'm just going to do a little bit of creepy shade subtly on this side of the cylinder to tell the viewer that it's going around. It's doing the go-round thing. Okay? That's all there is to it. 1/3 shade, 2/3 base coat, a little bit of creepy shade. What happens on the inside of the cylinder? Well, my light source is hitting it, boom, like right about there, right? So if my light source is hitting it here, it's coming in from this angle, I'm actually going to see shade on the opposite side, because the light source, if it's hitting that rim right there, it's going across this opening. That means the light is hitting this edge right about here, okay? So I'm going to actually do the opposite with my shade on the inside of the cylinder. Simple, okay? Gonna keep it straight. Okay, here's another thing that people tend to do. They keep wanting to like curve it like this, okay? What they're actually responding to is they're actually responding to what happens to the cast shadow when the cast shadow drops around on the inside of the cylinder. That's cool. When we get to cast shadow, that's exactly what we're going to do. But don't do that yet. Right now, keep the geometric shades and lowlights clean, and you're going to continue to do this in trompe-l'oeil. So when we get into working on molding structures in the barn door and marble panel assignment, when we get to that, I'm going to keep saying, paint this section as if it's the only thing that exists. Nothing else exists in the world. Just sculpt this section. So all we're doing right now with this part of trompe-l'oeil is we're sculpting chiaroscuro, okay? We're just sculpting form. Later, with our cast shadows and to a fair extent with our highlights, then we're going to place these forms in situ. But until then, all we're doing at this point is we're sculpting form. Turning the light back on. Okay. So, just like the sphere now, I'm going to come back, but I'm going to keep these really straight. So it's 2/3, 1/3. So 1/3 of the area of this cylinder now is going to go into my low light. And once again, I'm going to leave a little bit of that shade showing on the edge there, right? A little bit of creeping light. And later, if you want to play with it a little bit more, you can decide, I'm actually even going to leave a little bit of base coat showing there. That's fine. Once you get the techniques down, then you can start, like I said before, you can start messing around with it, making it more dramatic, okay? All right, so that's our shade and our low light on the cylinder? Do we see some low light here? Probably. I would say most of the low light, if the light's coming here, we know that the shade on the inside of this cylinder is going from probably about here to about there, right? Right where we painted it. So if there is low light at all, it's probably directly behind this area of where our highlight is going to go. But like I've said before, we're artists. We're trying to enhance things so that they read well from a distance. So if we wanted to sneak just a little bit of low light into that corner there, just to, you know, bring it home, we totally can do that, okay? Because we're artists, we get to do what we want, as long as we do what we know why we're doing it, and that's why we're doing all of this, talking about how to do this so that you know why you're doing something. The point is, I don't, as you start to work through trompe-l'oeil and start to work through forms, I don't want you to have to grope. I don't want you to have to go, does the shade go here? Does this go there? Oh, that doesn't look right. I want you to be able to map it out in your mind and go, I know how to sculpt this form. I know how to make this form happen, okay? I want you to be able to see the form in your head in a three-dimensional way and be able to understand where to place your shades and your lowlights and your highlights to be able to sculpt that form. That's what we're working towards, so that you have that kind of, you can see it in that way. Okay, so now we're going to place our highlight, and once again, it's the rule of threes, right? So we've got this much area here that is the the leftover, the base coat, right? So we're going to choose to put our highlight 1/3, 2/3, okay? 1/3, 2/3, and that's the sweet spot for our highlight. Now, because this highlight can be descriptive, we can, if we want, we can have that highlight start out strong at the top, and then if we wanted to, we can have it fade out as it drops down towards the bottom of the cylinder. Your call, okay? But this is a sweet spot for where our highlight goes. Now, as you look at cylindrical forms in art, a lot of times you're going to see these really wackadoo highlights on things, on cylindrical forms, and even some wackadoo shades and lowlights on these forms. And you'll see another highlight, right? Absolutely. That, when you start to multiply highlights and put highlights in adjacent to one another, start playing with the shape, the colors of the highlights, some of them are white, some of them are like a steel gray, right? That's usually denotes visually a very, very shiny object, and the way curved form is described on very, very shiny surfaces, all right? We're not going to push that just yet. Later, I have students play with that in trompe-l'oeil work that they do in intermediate and in advanced. Right now, let's just concentrate on sculpting the form, okay? Now, remember I told you that highlights can land on edges and on form? So this is the highlight here that's landed on the form, all right? Now, I have this edge. I have the edge of the trash basket. Here it is again. Here's our trash basket. Look at that highlight along the edge of that trash basket. Look at that thing, okay? It's big, it's bright, it's bold. What I like to do is when I do these highlights on these edges of forms, I'm like, okay, light's coming in like this, right? So I kind of visualize an axis going across the form like that. And then I'm like, I have my edged highlights kind of start on at that center of that axis and then go around and fade off. Oh, and here we know we have, if you want to, you can have a little bit, but keep it more subtle. back there. You can have a little bit of a highlight dropping down on the inside of the cylinder. And then I'm going to start my highlight there and bring it around, okay? And by doing that, it helps describe the axis of the light. Sharp highlight, edged highlight here, sharp edged highlight back there. So it helps describe that axis of light, okay? Then, just like the sphere, if we wanted to, we could play with a little bit of bounce light. Okay? All right. Cast shadow on this guy. Here's the deal. What we're going to do, we have our ellipse here. Remember our ellipse? It's right in here, okay? This is the horizontal axis of our ellipse. This is the vertical axis of our ellipse. We're going to start with a projection from that point on the ellipse at the base of our cylinder. Light source coming in like this, cast shadow projecting along the horizontal surface behind it like that. Then, remember we talked about made of glass. The form is made of glass, like when we were talking about the cube. So we're going to go, where is light hitting? We know it's hitting here, and we know it's hitting here. So this high lit or lit section of the cylinder is probably dropping off right about here, and we know it's dropping off right about there. So we're going to project the lines of our cast shadow out from there. Now, what's happening with the top of this? Okay, this ellipse is parallel to this ellipse. This ellipse is sitting on a parallel or on a flat horizontal plane. So we know that the orientation of this ellipse is horizontal. If we had a line, like if this cylinder was actually a box, right? We have this horizontal line of this axis. So what we can do is, it's like, here's our light source. We're going to project down, project down along the edge to find out where the edge of this is going to stop right there, okay? And then we're going to go draw a horizontal, that's not a very horizontal line, we're going to draw a horizontal line out, okay, from that axis point. We know that this curve is affecting our shadow, so then we're going to put that curve, foreshortened ellipse again, remember, into our shadow, and there's the shadow of our cylinder. I actually flunked coloring. I'm not kidding. I flunked coloring in middle school. I didn't flunk. I got a C when I was coloring the world map because I didn't stay in the lines. And my crayon strokes didn't all go in the same direction. They did what I just did there. They went, who knew, right? Okay, the cylinder. We're going to do a quick review of cones and pyramids, just really quick, and then we're going to move on to the torus. All right, we're on to cones and pyramids. I do not have a model of a pyramid. I am banking on the assumption that you have all seen pictures of the pyramids in Giza, okay? So, cone, based on a cylindrical or shape. So everything we talked about in terms of cylinders will be useful in terms of describing a cone. As for the pyramid, everything that we talked about in terms of cubes will be useful for the discussion of a pyramid. So in terms of drawing these two forms, you need to remember, once again, to rely on your axes. Draw go a little bit farther down, going to draw the cone first. So if this is the distance between the two outside edges of my cone base, I want to find the middle. Go straight up from that, right? And then that is the shape of the two outside edges of my cone. The base, the same thing as we did with the cylinder. You need to determine the amount of foreshortening of the base, and then equidistant from your horizontal axis. You're going to draw an elliptical form that is a foreshortened circle. And remember that trick of drawing through the form as if it's made of glass, just to keep you kind of honest. Make sure that you're not doing anything that's too lopsided. Okay? And then we can just get rid of these interior lines, and we have the shape of our cone. For the pyramid, same concept. We're going to have two outside edges, just a little bit farther over, two outside edges, right? And then the center axis. This constitutes all the faces, this width, all the faces of our pyramid that we can see. So here we are. Remember when we did the cube, we sort of cheated and we kept the front face of that cube horizontal, like parallel to the picture plane. All right, we're not going to do that with this pyramid. We're going to make it look a little bit more natural, draw in some sight perspective. So if this is the width, say, of that pyramid, right, it's just a little bit beyond my thumb, we know that this has to be like a little bit shorter, okay? So I'm going to come down and then drop back. And this isn't exactly an equilateral pyramid that I'm drawing. It's steeper than that, okay? So we just need to make sure that in terms of sight perspective that this back leg that's dropping back farther into depth, okay, is more foreshortened, okay? And it doesn't actually have to be. We just need to make sure that we keep that axis so we can actually truly drop it farther back into depth, i.e. have this corner land farther up or back in the picture plane than this one, so they're not even at the same depth in the picture plane, okay? And then we have a pyramid that looks a little bit more natural. All right, so in terms of shading these two forms, what we're going to do is, on this form, we're going to remember our cube. On this form, we're going to remember our pyramid. So in terms of the cube, grab my light source chalk. I'm going to have the light source come in a little bit steeper this time. Makes it easier when I'm describing cast shadows. Okay. So in terms of describing this,
We know that we've got a four-sided pyramid, so we've got, if we could see through it as if it was made of glass, right? We would have, and if we drew an X through that foreshortened square, that X should line up. Yes, it does. Yes, that X should line up vertically with the point, okay? It just has to. Geometrically, it just has to work out that way. The point of the pyramid will always end up being directly above the center of the base. It has to happen geometrically every single time, as long as this pyramid is sitting on a flat plane like that. All right. So in terms of the shades on this, and with our light source coming at it, and that angle, we know that this side of the pyramid is facing away from our light source, but it's not super dark because it's also tilting more towards the light source. So we can shade this more subtly than we did the face of the cube, okay? And we're definitely going to have it be a little bit darker along this line, once again to punctuate the fact that this side of the pyramid is catching light, but we're going to let that back corner fade out. Now, essentially what's going to happen is the back corner here is going to end up being lighter than the front corner here, all right? And that's okay, because that sort of leads into an appearance of what's called atmospheric perspective. So atmospheric perspective, you think about a foggy day, okay? And when objects are farther away from us in the atmosphere, the details become less distinct, okay? The value range, because there's like this film of atmosphere between you and the object, the value range becomes narrower. So the light's not as light, the dark's not as dark. And also because this haze of atmospheres between you and that object, the color range, the chroma, becomes once again also a narrower band, so it's not quite as bright. The chroma is more neutral, right? And that's how you can layer on this concept of atmospheric perspective onto the elements of trompe-l'oeil that we're working to add to the illusion of painting and sculpting objects on two-dimensional surfaces to represent realistic objects. And then, of course, as scenic artists, a realistic structure. Of course, as scenic artists, what we do then is we exaggerate that a little bit because that's our job, okay? So, do we need a low light on this pyramid? And the answer is no, we don't. I mean, think about the fact that, if this was a cube, yeah, you could definitely throw some low light in there, like we did on the cube. But this plane is actually tilting towards the light source. So putting a low light on that is probably a little bit too exaggerated, unless the context of what you're doing is more exaggerated. If you do want to make it more exaggerated, if that seems, if that's where the designer is going with the subject matter, then yeah, you can push it a little bit and just drop a little bit of low light along that edge if you really wanted to punch it, right? Okay? So that's putting the shade and low light on our pyramid, doing it on the cone just like we did with our cylinder. Remember, it's 2/3, 1/3, okay? Rule of threes. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to shade. Do a little bit of blending there, right? We're going to shade a third of our cone and leave a third, 2/3, excuse me, in the base coat color. Same as our cylinder,
We can, making sure that we taper it, thicken it a little bit at the bottom. We can definitely do that creepy thing shape because we're still dealing with a circular object. So this is a contrivance. Another contrivance that we can do with this cone, especially because it's leaning into the light source a little bit, is, remember the whole concept of creepy light and leaving a little, crescent of shade showing on the back side of that sphere? We can even push that a little bit farther with this cone, and we can leave a little crescent of the base coat showing on the edge of this cone because it's definitely like facing into the light even more. Okay, so we're going to, push that even a little bit more because of the form and its relationship to the light. So we've got our shade in there. Do we need a low light? No, not necessarily, for the same reasons that we really didn't need a low light on the pyramid. But with the cone, that discussion is like a little bit more important because of description. We have a cylindrical surface here, and we're trying to describe that cylindrical surface. So for the sake of describing that, I would say I would generally lean towards, even if it's subtle, putting a low light. And it might taper out almost completely by the time you got to the peak. Putting about 1/3 of my shade in at least a darker value or a low light value, just to help describe the cylindrical nature of the object. Then moving on to highlights. Remember, we have this pyramid. It's on a square base, so we're going to once again describe that square base. Okay? And if we put our X through that square base, we're there. So we know that this face here and this face here are probably catching the most light, especially if we've decided to put this face into the shade. So our light's coming at this angle, and it's definitely probably catching this back face right there. So we know that this is where our edged highlight is going to go. We also know that this face of the pyramid is definitely, we can catch an area, structural highlight here, right? We can let it fade out a little bit if we want as it comes towards us. All right. Have it be a little bit more pronounced as it approaches that edge. And then we can put our edged highlight in. And once again, if we want to, we can have it be nice and sharp up here. And then go ahead if you want to, and just to help further define the object, have it fade out a little bit as it drops down towards that corner. Here on our cone, same as our cylinder, we're going to find that sweet spot of 1/3, 2/3, okay? And we're going to lay our highlight in. And it's going to taper and widen out with the surface as it drops down. Okay? And then, once again, secondary highlight, you can say, well, it doesn't necessarily need it, but also because we're trying to describe a cylindrical form, I'm going to use that secondary highlight to definitely lay in and help describe that cylindrical form. Once again, observing that 1/3, 2/3 rule. Okay, so I'm going to place that secondary highlight approximately 1/3 away from this edge and 2/3 away from this edge. Okay, so that it's foreshortening as it's going around the cylindrical form. Okay, and then, lost you there for a minute, but we're on to cast shadows. Now remember, I made my light source like a little bit more of an oblique or, sharp angle. I did that because here's the thing I keep running into when I'm trying to describe how you do the cast shadow on a pyramid. Like, how often do you see photos of the pyramids of Giza and you actually aren't aware of there being a cast shadow? That's because the pyramids are at an angle, right? So the cast shadow is actually dropping onto the form itself. They really aren't getting much of a cast shadow. So you kind of have to have a pretty, like sharp angle, flattened angle to be able to describe the cast shadow of cones and pyramids. So for both of these, we're going to go back to finding our axes. Okay? Because it's our axes where we know that the point of the shadow has to end up. So it's from that axis dropping back in both cases. We know that that's where the point of the shadow from these two forms is going to end up. So then we draw our axis going back from these forms, and then we remember back here we decide where that highlight area leaves off, and we drop it back, and that's why it has to be a pretty discrete angle back there so that you can actually see a shadow dropping back, because lots of times you don't end up seeing a shadow dropping back on cones and pyramids. Okay, so we've got our shadow of our cone dropping back there behind the pyramid. Same thing with the pyramid. We know we have a plane right here, right? So we know we have a shadow dropping back from that plane, and we know we have a shadow dropping back from this plane, and we know that they both have to meet up at one point because it's a triangular form, and we have our shadow. Okay? So those are cones, pyramids, and the last thing we're going to move on to, and I know this is a long demo, is we're going to move into a discussion of the torus. All right, everybody, this is the last part of the chalkboard discussion on these shapes. After this, you'll watch a set of demonstrations where I have actually painted these shapes in trompe-l'oeil technique, and we'll once again go through the whole discussion again of where the shades go, the low lights, the highlights, all of that. In a scene painting and scenic design and design studio called the New York Forum and Studio of Scenic Design that was created in 1958 by Lester Polikoff, the main geometric form that he liked to work with to teach students trompe-l'oeil was the torus, or as his students like to refer to it, the great bagel of life, right? So maintaining, and he was absolutely right, that knowing how to manage this shape taught you so very much about how to manage almost every objective geometric form, and it does. I always like to teach Pissarro shapes and then work up to the torus because I think teaching the Pissarro shapes helps break things down a little bit. But now what we'll be doing with the torus is we'll be combining the cylinder and the sphere together in a form and thinking about it in those terms as it changes in its relationship to light. This beautiful model was created by Alan Trumpler, and when he retired from teaching, he gave it to me. So it's a wonderful piece to have. And this is the type of form that we're going to discuss. But as you're looking at this form, just right now, I want you to look at this and like kind of take a careful look at the way highlights and lowlights and shades are working on this form, and now we're just going to talk about their placement, okay? In terms of it being sculpturally a bas-relief, right? Bas-relief. I want you to pay attention to that because a bas-relief is a form that rises up off a plane, or you can have bas-relief sculpture that goes around the barrel of a column. You can have bas-relief sculpture that goes across the surface of the oval or kind of egg-like shape of a cartouche. So I want you to be very aware of what that term means, and in terms of the program here, you're going to be working in bas-relief sculpture both in terms of assemblage, so additive, and in terms of sculpting, subtractive practice. If you go through the entire Scenic Art program here, as well as doing a full 3D sculptural form. All right, so I want you to notice, you can see how perfect this circle is. I did use a compass, a chalkboard compass, to cartoon this circle. And something that I want you to pay attention to, I know it's kind of faint on your video, I have cartooned my compass point. This is very important. Whenever you cartoon a form that's based on a perfect circle, based on a compassed circle, you always need to mark and convey your compass point all the way through the cartoon, right? By the time you get to the final project, right, and the final product, if you get up close, you're still going to be able to find that compass point. It might be very, very vague and very, very hard to see, and it's not something you can pick up on from a distance, but being able to find that compass point again is extraordinarily important, because a lot of times what we end up doing, especially when we have perfect circular shapes like this, is we actually put our brushes in the ends of compasses. And to be able to find that compass point again easily is extraordinarily useful and saves a lot of time. So anytime you cartoon a circle or a shape that's based on compassed points, so arches, whatever, you're always, always going to ensure that it's easy enough to find that compass point again for later use. Okay, so thinking about this in terms of, like, you know, our sphere and our cylinder, there's our light source, right? What we're going to do is, and having the compass point helps here too. So here is our direction of light, right? We have our direction of light that goes through right about there, okay? Once again, just like the sphere, we're going to find that perpendicular that axis that is perpendicular to our direction of light. The other thing that is useful to find are those offsets from that. Those 30-degree offsets can help tell us when the shade or the highlight needs to start trailing off, when it's going to start diminishing. Right, so having done that, we can make these a little bit more vague, right? But we have those there. What we're going to do is we're going to treat this like a cylinder, right? So we're going to start with the shade. So we're going to find that point, right, where it's about 2/3 and 1/3, right? Same thing here on this side of the form. We're going to find that point where it's about 2/3 and 1/3. Now, just like the sphere, we know that our shade needs to have diminished or faded out, right, by the time it gets to that axis.
and by the time it gets to the axis here, okay? So we're going to go around and we come to those 30-degree axes and we know it's time to find a point where our shade begins to diminish, right? We'll lay our shade in here.
Okay.
And then here, and then we know it's time for our shade to begin to diminish. Those 30-degree axes, it's stopped completely by the time we get to the perpendicular axis. And it's really straightforward. It's basically just almost, it's super formulaic. Laying in off a little bit. Now something that I want you to remember when you do this, and another thing that can also help when you do this shape, is off the center opening of a torus. If you kind of lay a couple of axes off to the side there that skirt the outer circumference of this, that really keeps you honest in terms of not overextending. So you don't want to overextend, right? You don't want to overextend that shade so it kind of sticks out and kind of goes and comes back in to the center of the opening, right? You want it to like drop off almost perpendicularly to that axis, okay? All right, so moving on then to our lowlights. Now let's talk a little bit about painting something that's a bas-relief as opposed to painting a form that's freestanding. Especially with these cylindrical or circular forms, when they're freestanding, remember we talked about keeping that low light just like offset from that edge a little bit, all right, that outside edge, so that, you know, you're allowing, you know, like the idea of bounce light coming around from the back side, doing the go-round thing, right? If you are doing something that's a bas-relief, what you want to do is, or what you can do, is literally connect, okay? You can connect, so we're choosing a point about 1/3 the area of our shade, and we're definitely going to let that low light fade out long before it gets to the perpendicular axis, all right? But if you have it connect, that helps connect the object to the surface. The other function that helps it connect directly to the surface, and we'll talk about this later when we actually paint, is the cut line. So if you have a cut line on the outside edges of a freestanding object and you just like run that cut line all the way up and down, first of all, it looks cartoony. Second of all, that cut line does a weird optical thing where it actually connects the object to the background. So if you let that cut line fade off, it actually doesn't connect it to the background, all right? So cut lines are another way, another function of telling or tricking the eye into understanding whether an object is connected like in a bas-relief to the surface or whether that object is freestanding. So we're going to come here once again about 1/3, okay? And once again, we're not going to go quite all the way up to our perpendicular axis, and we're going to lay in about 1/3 of that area in low light, okay? Like so. Now, because we're, oh, my sleeve, ha ha ha. Okay, because we're in theater and we do drama here, all right, we're going to, once again, do a little bit of a cheat. So we're coming with this shade, when we do our shade, we're actually going to cheat a little bit, try and stay inside the lines, and have just a little subtle hint of shade go around that outside edge to, like, say, going around, again saying going around, right?
For the sake of drama. All right. Now, highlights, just like our cylinder, right? Okay. We have, this is our area here. We're going to choose that sweet spot as the focal point of our highlight, about 2/3 and 1/3, all right? And here, about 2/3 and 1/3. That's going to be the sweet spot for our highlight. So now, we're going to lay our highlight in, and we're going to, once again, let it trail off before it gets to that perpendicular axis. But it's going to be localized around that 1/3 to 2/3 area. It's definitely going to approach those outside edges. Just going to have it stop short of actually touching them, okay? All right? And then we'll go through and we'll find, once again, our sweet spot for our highlight. Within that highlight area, about 1/3 to 2/3 of that highlight area. Find that sweet spot for our secondary highlight. Find that sweet spot for our secondary highlight. About 1/3 to 2/3. Lost that a little bit. There we go. Okay. So then we've sculpted a great bagel of life. All right. Now, if we're doing the cut lines, right? Normally, if this is a freestanding shape, if it's just like an object that's like sitting on a plane, right? We know just like the sphere, it can literally only touch on one point down here, okay? So we will, we know that like the sphere, we might have a cut line that's just like a little bit of a description there. But if this is like, we're looking at this as a bas relief, well, then literally, because it's where two planes are converging, coming away from us, we can actually have a cut line that just is almost complete. We're just leaving it open a little bit on the highlight side, and that will help connect this object to the surface. Okay? Coming back along. With our cast shadow, right? Our light's coming from this direction. And you'll find, and you'll see, once we start working with glazes, cast shadows that are glazes, that is paint that doesn't have, thin paint that doesn't have any white in it, you'll find that we're actually able to pull this cast shadow up over this area some, and that will deepen our shade area there, okay? And then coming around here, we would have a cast shadow that would drop back like this. And once again, we would be able, once we get to paint,
to bring our cast shadow up around here and deepen that shade there, okay? So that is the torus. That's the whole deal on the chalkboard demonstration of geometric shapes. And in the next set of videos, you'll be watching all these shapes be painted straightforwardly with scene paint. Okay? Thank you very much.